also going to be a set of 3. Whereas, here in the Eudicots, again, if you see a leaf that has, 5 leaves, or sorry, 5 petals, then this is going to be example of a Eudicot or a dicot. Other questions?
A very quick review, just so difference, Eudicots are going to have 4s and 5s, and then 3s for monocots, fibrous roots versus tap roots, and then they'll have, in the stem and the ring, like you were saying, the star would be more the Eudicot than the, like a circular.
That kind of circular ring of vascular bundle is going to be in the monocot, yeah. And then just the number of cotyledons. That's where we get the name monocot or dicot. Monocot is 1 cotyledon, dicot is 2. Yeah, so that last slide, this one right here, this is a good summary for the difference between monocots and dicots. This looks like a short answer question to me. What are the differences between monocots and dicots? All right. Now we're going to talk about leaves, if that's okay with y'all. Y'all go with that? All right. So the leaves are going to be what's responsible for the photosynthesis. So the photosynthesis, it doesn't happen in the petals, it doesn't happen in the roots, it doesn't happen in the stem. It's happening in the leaves. Because the leaves have these specialized cells that contain the chloroplasts, which are responsible for photosynthesis. And so when you're talking about the structure of leaves, you can see 2 different versions. A lot of leaves have these kind of netted veins. You can see this is all veins, part of the vasculature. All right, and then others will just have these long sheets of leaves, or not sheets of leaves, but the vasculature is going to be in these parallel lines moving in between. And so these are going to be the 2 patterns for the vascular bundles in the leaves. Either they're going to be this netted kind of leaf, or they're going to be these veins that are running parallel to one another. And so each blade, there are different structures associated with it. So if you look at a leaf, there's my stem, there's my leaf. This is called the blade. So a leaf is, or this whole thing technically is called the leaf. This is called the blade, and then this part right here, this is called the petiole. This is basically like the mini little branch that's holding the leaf onto the rest of the stem. And so when we're talking about the structure of the leaves, there's going to be one main type of cell that's going to be responsible for photosynthesis. And that's going to be these mesophyll cells. And these mesophyll cells are going to be made primarily of parenchyma. And so all of these mesophyll cells, which make up a majority of the leaves, are all going to contain multiple chloroplasts. And those chloroplasts contain multiple thylakoids. So there's going to be all this photosynthesis occurring in the mesophyll. And again, this mesophyll is this layer of parenchymal cells that's kind of, on the outside of the leaf. Even though a leaf is really thin, once you get in there and look at all the layers, there's lots of different layers. And so these mesophyll is going to be the majority of the types of cells towards, the outer air. And so here you can see kind of a diagram of a leaf. Here we have an actual picture, not just a drawing, but you can see all of these mesophyll cells. So a lot of these are going to be these parenchymal cells that are going to make up the mesophyll tissue. And you're also going to have these stoma. And we've talked about stoma before. This is where this gas exchange is going to occur. So it's like a little hole in the leaf where it can release oxygen and then bring in carbon dioxide in order to make sugars using photosynthesis. And so again, here we have all these mesophyll tissues or mesophyll cells, and you can see each one has, about a dozen or so chloroplasts. So there's lots of photosynthesis going on in these mesodermal tissues. A leaf is also going to have, the epidermis, which is going to be part of the dermal tissue. Remember we said the dermal tissue is kind of like the outside parts of the plants? Well, that dermal tissue is going to be made up of the epidermis. So just like this is called our epidermis, it's like the skin of us, well, plants have an epidermis too. And so it's just kind of that outer layer that's kind of protecting the leaf. And so here you can also see these vascular bundles right here. So this is going to be the xylem, which is only transporting, upwards towards the top of the plant. And then this is going to be your phloem, which is traveling both directions, moving those sugar molecules around. And so if you look at the structure of an individual leaf, again, you have the blade, which is essentially the majority of the leaf. You've got these veins, which are part of the vasculature. And then you've got this petiole, which is the little kind of stalk that's holding it on to the rest of the plant. And so from this, what I want you to take away is that the kind of basic structure of a leaf, that these mesophyll cells are mostly parenchyma, and these are going to be the photosynthesizing guys. And then also you're going to have these vascular bundles, moving sugar and water and nutrients around. And then you've got these stoma, which is where you're going to have this gas exchange. And so you can see that in this picture as well, right here. Yes?
Is that where dew comes from, kind of?
Is that where dew comes from?
Because
Dew
it's
comes
showing
from
the
moisture in the
H2O.
air.
Yeah, but it's showing H2O coming out of it. So.
Well, I mean, water's constantly moving in and out of everything. It's moving in and out of us, it's moving in and out of plants. Water's essential to life, so a lot of the times, water, through a process called transpiration, water will be evaporated from the plant.
Oh.
So if it's like in a desert, the plant will dry out, it'll dehydrate. And so a lot of the times that water gets sucked out through those stoma as well. But the main job of them is to, exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. Other questions? Okay, so we've kind of already briefly introduced the notion of roots and the two different types. Again, we've got the taproot that has the main root system, and then we've got the fibrous root, which is a bunch of similar size roots. And so these taproots are going to be found in the dicots, and the fibrous roots are going to be found in the monocots. And each root has its own specific anatomy. And so when you look at these roots, the main purpose of the roots is to help absorb water and nutrients from the soil. And so what will happen is they'll enter from the soil into the roots, and they'll be moved upward. And again, this water and nutrients are being moved upward through the xylem. And then the photosynthesis that's occurring in the leaves is going to be the phloem is going to be transporting those sugars back up and down the entire plant.
What is, sorry?
So, what?
Phloem, back up.
The phloem is both ways, and the xylem is just upward. And so the more surface area you have on these roots, the more water and nutrients you're going to be able to absorb. So out of these two, which one do you think is going to absorb better? The fibrous, right? Because it's got more surface area. And each one of these roots, no matter if it's a taproot or a fibrous root system, are going to be made up of 3 different, what are called zones. And so these different zones of the root are going to have various different functions. The first zone is going to be called the zone of cell division. So I'll give you one guess on what's happening in the zone of cell division. Cell division is happening in the zone of cell division. And so this is part of that apical meristem. Remember we said the apical meristem helps the plant grow up and down. And so you have them on the roots, and then you have them on the top part of the plant. Well, this apical meristem is going to be at the end of one of these roots. And so this apical meristem is, again, a region of dividing cells. So as you make more cells, the tip of this root is going to grow down, and that's what extends the root further into the soil. In the zone of cell division, you're also going to have what's called a root cap. And this root cap is just the very little tip of the root, and it's kind of this hardened region so that when the roots grow downward, they're not being damaged as they move through the soil. So it's kind of like this, construction hat or something to help guide it through the soil so it doesn't get damaged. And so in the zone of cell division, again, you've got the apical meristem, which is, what's giving length to the plant. And then you've got the root cap there, which is there just to protect the end of the root as it grows down into the soil. The next zone is called the zone of elongation. And so in the zone of elongation, you have all of this tissue. You've got some vascular tissue, you've got some ground tissue made up of parenchyma, and then you've got this area where these cells will expand or elongate. And they elongate as they absorb more water. So they're just absorbing water, getting bigger, bigger, and bigger. And so this is also contributing to the growth of the roots down into the system. So as these cells in the zone of elongation fill up with water, that's going to help push those roots further into the soil. So you're literally just lengthening these cells because they're filling up with lots of water, and that's going to help contribute to that primary growth as well. And then finally you have the zone of maturation. This is going to be a region where all of these cells in here are going to become specialized. So all the cells are made up in the zone of cell division. And then once they've divided, they'll move into their appropriate region, and a lot of them will move into this zone of maturation. And so there's multiple different types of plant cells, which we've discussed. And so once a cell gets made, it has to specialize. So just like we have specialized cells, we have specialized kidney cells, we've got specialized heart cells. You know, plants have specialized cells as well. Some will do this function, others will do that function. And so the place where these cells come to differentiate or to specialize in a particular function is going to be in this zone of maturation. And so you can see this cross-section of this root right here. This is kind of that star-shaped pattern that we were talking about for the vasculature that's going to be found in the dicots. So if you take a dicot and you take a root and you cut it in half and look at it, it's going to have this pattern of vasculature, this kind of star shape, which is going to be the vascular bundle, which includes the xylem and the phloem. Questions? All right, make sure you know what each of the three different zones of the root are. And so for the zone of cell division, again, also make sure that you remember the root cap is down here, and then the apical meristem is going to be where these cells are actively dividing. Okay, so we've kind of talked about herbaceous plants. Now we're going to transition and talk about these woody plants. Again, these woody plants are going to include all the different types of trees. And so when you're looking at one of these woody plants, instead of having lateral meristems and apical meristems and intercalary meristems, instead of having meristems, these woody plants will have what are called these regions of cambium. And so there's two different types of cambium that can be found in these woody plants. The first one is called the vascular cambium. And the vascular cambium is going to be a thin layer of dividing cells that's going to be in between the primary xylem and the phloem. And so in these woody trees, you know, you start off, when you plant a baby tree, it's only going to have maybe one set of xylem and phloem. But as the tree grows wider and taller, it's going to make a second set of xylem and phloem. That's the secondary xylem and the secondary phloem. And then as it ages a little bit more, it'll make another layer, which is going to be the tertiary, tertiary xylem and the tertiary phloem. And then if you have another, then it's going to be the quaternary. So as the tree ages, it grows outward. And so when you look at a tree, you can determine the age by looking at the rings. Each one of those rings on a tree is the new xylem and phloem that's arising. And it's always going to arise from this vascular cambium. So in our little baby plants, all right, so here we're going to have our xylem is going to be right here, and then our phloem is going to be right here. So as this continues to divide and produce new tissue, it's going to create new xylem and new phloem. And then as it ages, these are going to be pushed back, and then it's going to make another layer of new xylem and new phloem. So These new xylem and new phloem are always going to be made on both sides of the vascular cambium. And then as the tree ages, it'll get pushed back, and then it can make a new set of xylem and phloem. So when you're hearing about primary and secondary xylem and phloem, the primary is the first one that was there. The secondary comes, a year later. The third one comes a year later after that. Yeah.
So the newest one's always
The
closest to
newest ones are
middle?
always on the outside.
On the outside?
Yeah. And so when you look at a tree, a lot of the tissue, if you chop a tree down, you see all the rings and everything, a lot of those small rings at the very beginning, that was the start of the plant. But as the tree gets bigger and wider and wider and wider, you can't get enough water and nutrients to the central region of the tree, which is why a lot of the tree, the middle of the tree, is already dead cells. And so it's the outer layers of the tree, these newer regions, the older regions are going to be kind of mostly the dead tissue, whereas the new tissue is going to be, kind of more the outer parts that are having easier access to water and nutrients. But the primary xylem is going to be responsible, the vascular cambium is going to be responsible for making these new layers of xylem and phloem within a tree once it ages. And again, this is all happening in secondary growth, so as the tree is getting wider and older. One other thing to note is, when we talk about trees, we say that it's made out of wood. So we know wood is just wood, but the actual structure of wood is going to be this secondary xylem. So this secondary xylem, this new layer that was just produced, is going to actually make up the wood. And so when you see these, tree rings, the actual wood is made up of this secondary xylem. And so, and again, it's this vascular cambium that's going to give rise to all those different layers of xylem and phloem.
Xylem was the wood outer.
The secondary xylem. So the second xylem that's made from the vascular cambium is going to be the wood. And so when you look at a tree, it looks like all wood, and that's because the majority of it is this secondary xylem. So the secondary xylem that gets made makes up a large chunk of the width of a tree. And so, or a width of wood, I should say, but a tree, being an example of wood. And then you also have, so you've got all these layers of primary xylem and secondary xylem and phloem everywhere. You've also got bark. You know what bark is. Bark is the kind of hard outer stuff on the, on a type of tree. Well, that bark is made up of several different layers as well. And so what's going to give rise to this bark is going to be another type of cambium called the cork cambium. And so the cork cambium, so here, if you look at this, you can see the vascular cambium right here. This is giving rise to the xylems and the phloems. And then you have the cork cambium external to that, which is going to give rise to what's called the periderm. So the periderm is this outermost layer of tissue around a tree. And that periderm is going to be made up of 3 layers. That 3 layers is going to include the cork cambium, which is the spot that's giving rise to the periderm in the first place. You've got a layer of parenchyma cells, and then you've also got what's called cork. And so cork is, where we get cork from. It's a layer of the tree that we can harvest from trees. And so these 3 things together, the cork cambium, the cork, and then this layer of living parenchymal cells is going to make up the periderm. And again, this periderm is going to be there kind of as a protective feature for the tree. And so the periderm plus the parenchyma layer plus the cork cambium is what's going to make up the bark of a tree. So when you see bark, you just think of it as like the flaky stuff, but it's actually several different layers of tissues.
Can you repeat what makes up the peridium?
Yeah, the periderm is going to be made up of a layer of parenchymal cells, the cork cambium, which is what's giving rise to the paraderm, and then the non-living cork cells. So it's a layer of cork, it's the cork cambium, and then this layer of parenchymal cells. And so that makes up the paraderm, which is this outermost region along the tree.
So then what else about?
So the bark is going to be made up of, so here, and we'll go back just to show you. So here, the bark is going to be made up of the paraderm, which has those 3 layers. So the bark is going to consist of the paraderm plus the secondary phloem. And so bark is going to be the cork cambium, the cork, the layer of parenchymal cells, and then also this secondary xylem that's being made. And so paraderm, which has its own components, is just a component within the bark. So you've got all these layers together that make up the bark. So it's going to be the paraderm, which includes the parenchyma, the cork cambium, and the cork, and then the secondary phloem as well. All right, so let's go back, not to skip ahead too much. All right, any other questions about the cork cambium or the paraderm? So there's, like we said, there's 2 different types of cambiums in these woody plants. And this is only for woody plants. All right, the cork cambium gives rise to the cork and the paraderm, whereas the vascular cambium gives rise to all the vascular tissue. That's why it's called the vascular cambium. So the cambium are these regions of growth that are occurring in woody plants. So they're kind of comparable to the meristems in the herbaceous plants. All right, they're both regions of actively dividing tissue that are contributing to the overall growth of the plant. All right, so